Welcome back. This series of videos is going to be a turning point in our class because we're going to be moving away from all of the types of non-experimental research that we've talked about, like, for example, field studies or survey research or correlational research, and we'll be beginning to talk about experimental research. And actually, we'll be talking about experimental research throughout the rest of the semester. And the purpose of this series of videos is to cover all of the vocabulary and terms that you need to understand in order to learn all of the details about experimental research. So the main focus of this series of videos will be vocabulary that you'll need to know as a foundation to learn about experimental research going forward. And the main terms that we'll be learning about are independent variable, dependent variable, and something called the levels of the independent variable. And in this video right here, I just wanted to give you a quick example of independent and dependent variable, and then after this video we'll move forward and we'll look at some specific examples of independent and dependent variables and some hypothetical psychology experiments. So I'm guessing that the first time you learned about the terms independent and dependent variable are in some math class, maybe in 8th grade, maybe in middle school, and you were shown an equation like this, y equals x plus 3, and you were probably told that y is the dependent variable because y depends on the selected value of x. Y depends on the value that you plug into x, because if you plug 1 into x, y becomes 4, but if you plug 2 into x, y becomes 5. So y basically depends on x. And you were probably told that x is an independent variable because x doesn't depend on anything inside this equation. X only depends on the value that you choose to plug into x. If you choose to plug 1 into x, x will be 1. If you choose to plug in 2, x will be 2. So like I said, x doesn't depend on anything in the equation. It just depends on what you decide it to be. So now let's move on to an imaginary psychology experiment, and let's try to create a similar type of equation for that imaginary psychology experiment. So I'm actually going to go back to the example I've been working with all along this semester, which is an experiment in which one group takes a recall test in a hot room, and then another group takes the same recall test in a cold room, and the researcher wants to look at the effect of temperature on memory. So in that experiment, each participant would get a recall score on the recall test, and also each participant will complete the recall task at his or her assigned temperature. So imagine that I decide to test someone at 60 degrees. Well then, I would plug in 60 degrees into here, into this equation, and I would get a recall score. And let me explain what I mean by extraneous variables. So extraneous variables are variables that aren't being studied in the experiment. So if I was looking at the effect of temperature on memory, and I had a hot room and a cold room, extraneous variables would be anything other than temperature, anything other than what I'm studying that might affect or that would affect recall scores. So extraneous variables would be things like time of day, for example. If it's 6 a.m., people might be tired. Another example might be hours of sleep. People who got a full night of sleep will probably do better than people who are sleep deprived. Another extraneous variable might be caffeine intake. Another example might be food intake. People who are hungry will probably do poorly on the recall test. So the way this equation works is, as a researcher who's doing that experiment, I would choose my level of temperature, which might be 60 degrees or 80 degrees, and I would plug it in right here. Then the effective temperature would get added along with the effect of the extraneous variables. I would get a recall score from the participant. So overall, the recall score equals the effective temperature plus the effect of all of the extraneous variables that aren't being studied together. And notice how in this equation, the recall score depends on the selected value of temperature. So it depends on the value of temperature that I've selected to plug in. But temperature doesn't depend on anything except for my selection, because as the experimenter, I'm deciding what I want to set the room temperature to be. So just like in this equation over here, temperature is independent and recall is dependent. Like I said, temperature depends only on my selection. It doesn't depend on anything else in the equation, but the recall score depends on um, the selected value of temperature. And I just wanted to hopefully have you see that this imaginary equation for the psychology experiment works the exact same way as this more basic equation that you probably learned a long time ago. And if you have any questions about this, just let me know. And now we'll move on to the next part of this series of videos.